In the name of God, in this session we will read about implicational universals and competing motivations. These two terms are very, very important in typology. At first, we will read about restrictions on possible language types. Here in these paragraphs, we will read the introduction about the restrictions which exist cross-linguistic study. The first step beyond typology as the classification of types and toward the explanation of the cross-linguistic variation that classification describes is the discovery of restrictions on possible language types. Okay, here in this lines again define the typology, which is classification of types, language types, and through that we read the cross-linguistic variation. And here we will read about the restrictions which exist on the possible language types. Linguistic theory in any approach, formalist or functionalist, typological, has as its central question: what is a possible language? This question can in turn be paraphrased as: of the logically possible types of languages, how do we account for what types actually exist? Here in this paragraph, we try to answer this question. One of the features that distinguishes the typological method of discovering constraints on possible language types is the empirical method applied to the problem. If a typologist wants to find restrictions on possible relative class structures, for example, he or she gathers a large sample of languages and simply observes which of the possible relative class types are present and which are absent. It is the empirical method by gathering the data concerning that matter. Here is a relative class. That is, the restrictions on logically possible language types are motivated by the actually attested language types. If there is a gap in the attested language types, then it is provisionally assumed that the gap represents a constraint on what is a possible language, and explanations are sought for the gap. This is the inductive method. When we gather data, through the data we draw a law. That is the inductive method, which must be used in constructing generalizations from empirical data. In contrast, the generative approach uses a rationalist deductive method, in which it is argued that certain analyses of single language represent universals of human language because they cannot possibly be learned by a child. Okay, this is the method of generative approach, which I think you know that the poverty of the stimulus, which Chomsky discussed that a child which its surrounded data is not sufficient, how he or she can dominate the language skillfully. We call that poverty of the stimulus, which based on that Chomsky believed that most part of our language is a divine gift, and we don't get it from the environment, and environment is as trigger to activate that. There are a number of objections that have been raised to the inductive method for determining gaps in logically possible language types. The first is that there may have existed languages that represented an unattested language type, or there may come to exist languages that do so. Virtually all linguists, however, use a working hypothesis of linguistic uniformitarianism. That is, it is assumed that the rules that govern language structure today are the same that govern language structure yesterday and will be the same that will govern language structure tomorrow. It is the linguistic uniformitarianism. Although human language arose from some language in perhaps some gradual way, those steps in the evolution of language are unattested, and the oldest records of human languages display the full range of structural complexity and the same kinds of structural types found in the modern languages. In fact, the greatest problem facing typological research is that the number of living languages, most of which are poorly described at best, is decreasing so rapidly that there may indeed be such a reduction of the database that the resulting typological generalization will be less secure. Okay, this is the first objection toward the empirical method to find the restriction on language. A second objection is that an unattested language type, it means that the language which does not exist, and we can't find that, is not necessarily an impossible language type. This fact cannot be denied, of course. It can only be mitigated. The primary mitigation is to have a language sample that is larger than the space of possible language types. For instance, let us consider a typological study of the word order of demonstratives. Okay. Numerals, genitive, and adjectives relative to the head noun. We want to consider this example. Typological study of word order of demonstratives, numerals, genitives, and adjectives relative to the head nouns. Each element may precede or follow the head noun. Hence, each parameter has two possible values. Modifier precedes or modifier follows. There are four logically independent parameters corresponding to the four kinds of modifiers. Multiplying together the number values on each independent parameters yield 16 logically possible types. For this study, a sample of 15 languages is simply inadequate, because here is 16. Even if every language were of a different type, one type would be unattested simply because the number of logically possible types is one more than the number of languages in the sample. A much larger sample, such as 50 or 100 languages, is necessary to avoid this problem. Determining sample size for typological study presupposes a clear definition of logically possible language types. This is not as easy as it appears. Some language types are logically impossible and hence can be excluded from the set of possible language types. For example, in typological study of pronouns and definiteness, one would not find a language with the indefinite first-person pronouns. This corresponds to a logically impossible type. Indefiniteness means the referent is not known to the hearer, but the first person refers to the speaker by definition and hence is known as such to the hearer. Likewise, one will not find a language with pharyngeal or laryngeal nasal. With a closure in the pharynx or larynx, it is not possible for air to pass into the nasal cavity. Logically impossible types are of course accounted for by straightforward external semantic or phonetic reasons. Nevertheless, the number of logically possible types is usually far greater than the possible type typically explored in typological studies. For example, studies on the category of number examine categories such as singular, one referent, dual, mean two, trial, mean three, and plural, unrestricted, not singular number. Universals can be formulated such as Greenberg's universal 34. You know that as whole, Greenberg has about 45 universals, implicational universal, dear student. As whole, Greenberg has 45 universal implicational universal, and the 34 number of Greenberg's universal is that no language has a trial number unless it has a dual. It means that it is not possible that we had a language which has three referent, but it means it loses dual referent. If a language has a trial number, it has a dual, certainly. No language has a dual unless it has a plural. This universal constrains the partitioning of sets of reference of the noun by the cardinality of the set. But the categories singular, dual, etc. by no means exhaust the logical possibilities. A language might have one number inflection if the number of referent is even, or a prime number, and another if the number is odd, or not a prime number. Yet not languages do. This fact is as deserving of explanation as Greenberg's universal 34. Another example of a similar phenomenon is in the study of number in person marking systems, pronouns and pronominal indexation systems. In a survey of 265 person marking systems, Kaiso argues that no language distinguishes a true first-person plural, multiple speakers, as in a chorus, from the usual first-person plural, a speaker plus other non-speaker, and likewise no language distinguishes a true second-person plural, multiple addresses, from a pronoun denoting addresses plus possible non-addresses. This universal also demands theoretical explanation. The range of genuinely logically possible types for any grammatical phenomenon is probably very large and in some cases infinite. Can or should one decide in advance how many logically possible types there are, and thus how large a sample is necessary for a typologist? The answer is no. One constructs a small sample and observes the range of attested types and, more important, the logically independent formal and external parameters defining the attested types. For example, a small survey of number systems will turn up some dual and perhaps a trial as well as plurals, but no odd, even, or prime, not prime systems. One can quickly form the universal that number categories will subsume contiguous portion of the cardinal number sequence, which, if made properly explicit, can be further tested and then construct a sample intended to capture the sorts of type universal 34 refers to, and also other possible categories such as quadral and quintal. Quadral mean 4 and quintal mean 5. A typological study always involves an interplay between deductive hypothesis and inductive generalization from languages. One might still object that even if we examine every existing human language, this still doesn't guarantee that unattested language types cannot ever come to exist. This objection to the empiricist method applies to any other method. However, any method for proposing constraint on possible language type can only be verified by the examination of actual languages. In those cases, one cannot be absolutely certain that one has verified the proposed constraint any more than one can be certain that an empirically arrived at typological universal is absolutely valid. A final important point about empirical generalization is that theoretical significance also accrues to the frequency of a language type, not just to whether it is attested or unattested. This is a crucial point because most language universals other than those excluding whether types like prime number have exceptions. A language universal is in fact a universal of cross-linguistic distribution. You should know that, dear student. This is important. You should know that a language universal is in fact a universal of cross-linguistic distribution. You should know that. A language universal is in fact a universal of cross-linguistic distribution. If one language type is very rare and another type very common, this distribution merits explanation even though both types are classed as attested. For example, the first universal listed in Greenberg's original paper on implicational universal is, dear student, this is the first implicational universal of Greenberg. In this implicational universal, based on Greenberg believed that this implicational universal exists in all of the languages. And by studying the different languages, we can attest that or we can unattest that. We can reject this Greenberg universal, but Greenberg believed that this 45 implicational universal exists in all of the languages. He believed that in declarative sentences, with nominal subject and object, the dominant order is almost always one in which the subject precedes the object. Okay. This is the first implicational universal of Greenberg. You should know the implicational universal as a whole. And you should mention them in your summarization. In declarative sentences with nominal subject and object, the dominant order is almost always one in which the subject precedes the object. As the italicized word indicate, Greenberg was aware of exceptions. A later probability sample indicated that the exceptional languages numbered approximately 5% of the total. Although Greenberg's universal has some exceptions, the student should know that about the universals of Greenberg. Although Greenberg's universal has some exceptions, it still remains to be explained why 95% of the world languages have the subject preceding the object in normal declarative sentences, whereas only 5% have the opposite order. Dreyer argues that most universals are of this type, a core of frequent types, fading out to a periphery of progressively rare types without a sharp line between possible and impossible types. You should know that. One important theoretical mechanism for explaining frequency patterns is competing motivation. Dear student, competing motivation is one of the vital terms in typology. Will be introduced in this chapter. For didactic purposes, however, we will begin by treating universals as exceptionless. Okay, dear student, in this first paragraphs we read about the restriction on languages, and we introduce them, and we read the objection toward the inductive method to finding that restriction, and even we define the universal again, and two of the Greenberg's universal were introduced, the first one and the 34 one, and here we told you that there may be exception on the implicational universal of Greenberg's. One of the important matter was competing motivation, which we explained that in the following. Unrestricted and implicational universals. One of the important measures in typology is implicational universal, which for the first time were mentioned by Greenberg. Greenberg's first universal and the order of subject and object is an example of an unrestricted universal. Dear student, as we told you, it is correct in about 95% of languages. Greenberg's first universal and the order of subject and object, which subject precedes the object, is an example of an unrestricted universal. Maybe I ask you in the final exam that the first universal order of subject and object in Greenberg's implicational universal is in which kind of universal? You should know that it is unrestricted universal. An unrestricted universal, dear student, here we define the unrestricted universal. You should know, you should be able to define that. An unrestricted universal is an assertion that all languages belong to a particular grammatical type on some parameter and the other type on the same parameter are not attested or are extremely rare. An unrestricted universal is an assertion that all languages belong to a particular grammatical type on some parameter and the other type on the same parameter are not attested or are extremely rare. Unrestricted universal characterize the distribution of languages along a single parameter. For example, the order of subject and object, or whether or not a language has oral vowel. The parameter allows for the logical possibility of more than one type, but only one type is attested or is extremely common in the case of unrestricted universal with exception. This is illustrated here with the unrestricted universal. All languages have oral vowel. It is unrestricted universal again. All languages have oral vowels. This sign, this symbol means that languages of the type exist, but this minus show that no languages of that type exist. This is the oral vowel on unrestricted universal because in all of the languages we have oral vowel. And no oral vowel, and it means that no languages of that type exist. It means that the oral vowel exists in all of the languages. In other words, there is a gap in the logically possible language types and the unrestricted universal states the constraint on language types along the relevant parameter. The number of unrestricted universal, again, other than those excluding bizarre types, such as prime number, is relatively small. Most unrestricted universals are built into the frameworks of linguistic theories because they are true of all languages. Nevertheless, as noted above, unrestricted universals require deeper explanation, just as much as implicational universal or other more complex cross-linguistic patterns do. Dear student, here we will read about the differences between implicational universal, which mentioned by Greenberg, which they were 45, and unrestricted universal. You should know the differences between them. You should be able to define and to distinguish them from each other. Implicational universals differ from unrestricted universal in that they don't assert that all languages belong to one type. Okay. Implicational universals differ from the unrestricted universal in that it means that the implicational universal don't assert that all languages belong to one type. Instead, they describe a restriction on logically possible language types that limit linguistic variation but doesn't eliminate it. We may illustrate this with a simple implicational universal. If a language has noun before demonstrative, then it has noun before relative clause. It is one of another implicational universal. If a language has noun before demonstrative, then it has noun before the relative clause. This implicational universal covers the following 4 logically possible types, dear student. These 4 types are covered by this implicational universal. Number 1. Demonstrative and relative clause both follow the noun. Demonstrative and relative clause both follow the noun. They comes after the noun. Like this language, Tinrin. Like this language with Tinrin mentioned that. Here, the relative clause follow the noun. Again, the demonstrative follow the noun. Therefore, in this language, both demonstrative and relative clause follow the noun. Okay, this is correct based on that implicational universal. Number 2, relative clause precede the noun and demonstrative follow the noun. Relative clause precede the nouns and demonstrative follow the noun. This type is not attested, but it is quite rare, found in only 9 genera of 201 for which information is available. Relative clause follow the noun and demonstrative precede the noun. Like here in English, the relative follow the noun. The book that she's reading right now. But here the demonstrative precede the noun. This book. This is the demonstrative and book is noun. Another one, the first one is demonstrative and relative clause both precede the noun. Like here. Here we have relative clause, then a noun, and demonstrative, then a noun. Both of them precede the noun. The implicational universal restrict language variation to types 1, 3, and 4 by excluding type 2. Okay, the implicational universal restricts language variation to the type first 3 and 4 by excluding the type 2, in which in 2 I want to this one. The relative clause precedes the noun and demonstrative follow the noun. It is not attested, or it is rare. The relative clause precedes the noun and the demonstrative follow the noun. It is rare. Therefore, based on the implicational universal, we exclude that. The demonstrative follow the noun and relative clause precedes the noun. Such implicational universals capture a pattern in language variation and differ from unrestricted universal, which account for uniformity, not variation. As such, implicational universal cannot even be discovered without cross-linguistic comparison. Here again we read the differences between unrestricted universal and implicational universal, which they are important, you should know them. Implicational universal cannot even be discovered without cross-linguistic comparison. One can examine a single language alone, such as English, and observe properties such as the presence of oral vowels that turn out to manifest unrestricted universal. It means that for unrestricted universal, reading just one language is enough. But implicational is concerned with cross-linguistic variation. We should read more than one language. Even so, one cannot assume that oral vowels are universal without examining a significant range of other languages. However, one could not guess from looking at English, which is type 3, in which the demonstrative precedes the noun and relative clause follow the noun, that types first and 4 are attested, but type second is not. One must look at a large sample of languages to determine the range of possible variation. This is what makes implicational universal the paradigm example of typological generalization. They represent the simplest form of restriction and language variation, and they can only be discovered through cross-linguistic comparison. What makes implicational universals more interesting than unrestricted universal above all, however, is that they state a dependency between two logically independent parameters. The 4 logically possible language types described in the preceding paragraph actually represent 2 independent parameters: demonstrative noun order and relative clause noun order. Each parameter has 2 values. The modifier precedes or the modifier follows. We may construct a table called a tetrachoric table that displays the 2 parameters as 2 dimensions. Dear student, this is very important. Tetrachoric table. Based on this table, we find the implicational universal. We draw the implicational universal through this table. In that, all of the possible situation of the parameter are represented. We call that tetrachoric table. We may construct a table called a tetrachoric table that displays the 2 parameters as 2 dimensions. This is important. What we mean by a tetrachoric table? In the tetrachoric table, we display the 2 parameters as 2 dimensions. Here we have a relative clause which precedes the noun. We have a language which in that demonstrative precedes the noun. This exists, but we don't have a language in which the relative clause precedes the noun, then the demonstrative follow the noun. This not exists. Therefore, we have a language which relative clause precedes the noun and demonstrative precedes the noun, both of them. But we don't have a language in which the relative clause precedes the noun and the demonstrative follow the noun, which is the second type in above paragraphs. But when in a language relative clause follow the noun, the demonstrative can follow or precede the noun. It means that both of them exist, both of the situation and possibility exist. The tetrachoric table is a useful means of displaying the empirical data of attested and unattested language types. Maybe I ask you about the function of and importance of tetrachoric table. You must say that it is a useful means of displaying the empirical data of attested and unattested language types. An implicational universal, on the other hand, is a relation that characterizes the distribution of attested and unattested language types. The pattern in the tetrachoric table basically matches the pattern of truth values in the truth table for implication found in propositional logic, whether T stands for true and F stands for false. Okay, what we read here through the tetrachoric table, dear student, this paragraph is very important. You should know about tetrachoric table and its function. Here we have a true or false, a true table or false for that implicational universal. Here we show the types and the parameters through this symbol, like PQ. If P then Q, we read it in this way: if P then Q. For example, if a language is the relative clause in language relative clause precedes the noun, then in that language the demonstrative precedes the noun. Description of a tested type. Based on we want to correspond this to each other. If a language in language the noun precedes the demonstrative, in that language the noun precedes the relative clause. This is attested, yes. If consider the this parameter noun preceded the demonstrative as P, and noun preceded the relative clause as Q. If P, then we have Q. This is attested. Both of them are true, then the result is true. If in language the demonstrative follow the noun, in that language the relative clause follow the noun. If P, then Q. It is correct. But if in language the demonstrative follow the noun, but the noun precedes the relative clause, it means that it is not correct in that language. We don't have such a language. The first one is true. If the noun precedes the demonstrative, but in that language then the noun follow the relative clause, that language does not exist. It is false. But if in language it means that it is unattested. The noun preceded the demonstrative, then the noun followed the demonstrative. In that language the relative clause follow the noun, that exists. But if in language the noun follow the demonstrative and noun follow the relative, that exists. If both of them are false, the result is true. It means that that language exists. Okay. I think, dear student, it is enough because for this session, because this table needs more explanation and it's very important. I think it is enough, and in the next session I will explain them this tetrachoric table again. Please look at this video and write its important matter for summarization, and you should know the definition of terms for your final exam. If you had any question, please ask me through the WhatsApp group. Thank you.